We also want to make the point that the challenges to academic freedom are global, and then we want to ask, if we widen our frame out beyond Eastern Europe and Central Europe, if we see the battle for academic freedom as we should, as a battle being fought in Africa and Asia, in North and South America as well, what do we learn? Why is it that universities are under attack in so many places, and what can we do about it? How do we deepen support for academic freedom so that when academics and professors and students fight for their freedom, our fellow citizens respond and say, you're fighting for us too? The politics of this, it seems to me, are crucial. We also want to look at the challenges coming from within, and these are red-hot controversial. There's nothing about academic freedom that is safe terrain. For some in the academy, the university must be a free space for every opinion, including hateful ones. On the other hand, there are others who feel equally passionately that the academy must refuse to lend its authority to ideas that question commitments to dignity, rights, and freedom. For some colleagues, there should be no safe spaces, no taboos, no trigger warnings to protect students from unwelcome ideas. And for other people, that idea of freedom just seems brutal. It seems to ignore the deep, enduring psychological harm that ideas can do. We're not going to resolve those conflicts today, but we need to understand just how controversial, just how contested the idea of academic freedom is from within. And if we're going to defend academic freedom, then we need to defend the debate about academic freedom and pursue it without fear or favor. Finally, and this really connects, I guess, to the lecture that we will have from Mario Vargas Llosa, one purpose of the conference is to connect the idea of academic freedom to democracy itself. This may seem obvious, but for many of our fellow citizens, academic freedom is sometimes regarded simply as the privilege of a professional caste, the professoriate. And that's done us harm. It's isolated us from the citizens that universities must always serve. And if academic freedom simply becomes reduced to the defense of the privileges of a professional caste, we will not have friends, and the friends we need when the wolves start to prowl around our doors. We need to remind ourselves that a society that has elections but doesn't have free institutions is actually not a free society. A society that does not foster places where ideas, including dangerous ones, are free to roam will not be free for long. And we hope, whatever else we accomplish, that the day will renew our faith as a group, whatever our political differences, in the vital connection between academic freedom and democratic life itself. To take us right into the thick of these questions, we need, as I said earlier, a wise woman, a trusted guide, an eminent scholar, a critical friend of academic freedom, whose writing on the subject has helped shape the debate for more than 20 years. And we're very, very lucky indeed to begin today with a lecture by Joan Scott. She's a professor emerita of history at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. She's a famous historian of France. Her works are assigned, I know, in CEU. She's taught at CEU. She's a friend of CEU. She's a great historian of the French Revolution and a great historian of the idea of human rights. The title of her talk is Academic Freedom, the University and the State. Please welcome Joan Scott.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, to be part of this ongoing conversation about academic freedom. And I want to particularly thank Michael Ignatieff, not only for inviting me, but for leading a fight these last months that has inspired many of us all over the world. As he said, what's going on at CEU is not unique to CEU, but the example that he's offered us in the eloquent defense of academic freedom that he's produced has been a really important and inspiring one. So thank you, Michael. So I'm going to talk about academic freedom. Academic freedom is highly specific to institutions of scholarly research and teaching. It's not like liberty or equality, a universal human right. It's not a general right of free speech, although the two are often confused. Instead, academic freedom applies to those of us who are associated with universities. It refers both to the internal functions of the university, to the research and teaching that go on here, and to the external relations of the university with the nation state. And it's the question of the relationship between the university and the state that I want to address today. The relationship is not a simple one. It's traversed by tensions that are necessary and unresolvable. And I want to look at two of those tensions. The first is between the search for truth and the demands of power, what might be called a tension between raison and raison d'etat. The second tension is between the hierarchical structure of the academy and the principles and practices of political democracies. I want to argue that academic freedom mediates both of those tensions. So first, the university and the nation. The origin of the modern university has everything to do with nation building. An older history is that of the religious sponsorship of universities with the various relations between churches and states affecting their governance. Medieval universities were established to train priests, lawyers, doctors, and schoolmasters, not always with state sanction. But it was Wilhelm von Humboldt who provided the model for the modern university at the University of Berlin early in the 19th century. One scholar has described its function this way. The Humboldtian University, he writes, is the institution charged with watching over the spiritual life of the people of the rational state, reconciling ethnic tradition and statist rationality. In Humboldt's vision, shared by many of his German idealist colleagues, the university's mission was to produce students committed to discovery and to inculcate the common language, history, literature, and geography that made possible the creation of a shared national culture. This unifying culture served not only a domestic function, but became an important arm of international competition and imperial expansion. From the late 18th century on, there's been a tension between two avowed purposes of the university: to educate the citizens of the nation state, and equally importantly, to encourage the critical thinking that would correct abuses of power and furnish the nation with the creativity and change that were vital to national well-being. Unfettered rational inquiry was taken to be the best guarantee of a healthy national future. This was Immanuel Kant's argument in The Conflict of the Faculties that he wrote in 1794. There, Kant insisted that the faculty of philosophy, the so-called lower faculty, was the most vital arm of the university because its job was to interrogate the very foundations of the higher faculties of theology, medicine, and law. Philosophy's interrogation was a correction, not only to stale disciplinary orthodoxy, but also to the dangers of unfettered state power and its influence on the more practical disciplines. Kant's essay captures the dilemma that faced the modern university: how to reconcile reason and the state, the search for truth, and the requirements of power. The literary scholar Masao Miyoshi described this dilemma as a tension between what he called utilitarian nationalism, whose aim was to secure the national good, and anti-utilitarian inquiry, which depends on free and spontaneous expression. Quote, "The university as an institution has served Caesar and Mammon," he wrote, all the while manifesting its fealty to Minerva, Clio, and the Muses. This tension at the heart of the university's mission has been apparent throughout its history, although changes in demography and curriculum in the nations of the West have sometimes made it less apparent. Neoliberal transformations have certainly taken attention away from both national agendas and critical thinking. Students are now more likely to be treated as paying clients, whose human capital can be enhanced by a university education, and whose vocational interests should dictate the curriculum. The research and development needs of private companies more often drive the inquiries of professors, especially in the sciences, and globalization, not national interest, is at the heart of what some have termed the information and knowledge industry. Still, I would argue that the Humboldt model has not entirely disappeared, its tensions remain as a legacy to be drawn on. And it's that legacy that I think it's important for us to think about preserving. Those tensions have been clearly evident in the post-colonial era as new nations emerged to claim identities either denied or suppressed by imperial rule. Edward Said wrote compellingly of this process in a 1996 article on identity, authority, and freedom. There he pointed out, referring to developments in the Middle East, that, quote, Arab universities are not only nationalist universities, but are also political institutions for perfectly understandable reasons. Understandable because all societies accord a remarkable privilege to the university and school as crucibles for shaping national identity. Once national independence had freed these nations from the yokes of Ottoman or European imperialism, he noted, an opportunity opened to educate young people to develop their pride in the traditions, languages, history, and culture of their own countries. The same might be said of the nations of Eastern and Central Europe after the end of Soviet rule in 1989. But a terrible problem soon arose, Said noted, when national universities were reconceived as extensions of the newly established national security state. As a result, the real value of education was short-circuited by a ruling party which sought political conformity rather than intellectual excellence. Quote, nationalism in the university has come to represent not freedom, but accommodation, not brilliance and daring, but caution and fear, not the advancement of knowledge, but self-preservation. Political repression, he went on, has never been good for academic freedom, and perhaps more importantly, it has been disastrous for academic and intellectual excellence. The two, academic freedom and intellectual excellence, are of course entirely interdependent. Without wanting to deny the importance of education for the construction of national identity, Said then asked, what national identity? Which national identity? And how might it be understood in relation to academic freedom? His answer, which I will quote at length because I can't match its clarity and eloquence, acknowledges the needs of the nation, but makes critical intellectual work its own raison d'etre. And this is the quote, my assessment of Arab academic life is that too high a price has been paid in sustaining nationalist regimes that have allowed political passions and an ideology of conformity to dominate, perhaps even swallow up civil institutions such as the university. To make the practice of intellectual discourse dependent on conformity to a predetermined political ideology is to nullify intellect altogether, end of quote. For Said, intellectual discourse is above all, again a quote, the freedom to be critical. Criticism is intellectual life, and while the academic precinct contains a great deal in it, its spirit is intellectual and critical, and neither reverential nor patriotic. It's the freedom to critique the terms of an exclusionary national identity that is vital both to the university and to the nation. Quote, otherwise I fear the old iniquities, cruelties, and unthinking attachments that have so disfigured human history will be recycled by the academy, which then loses much of its real intellectual freedom as a result. End of quote. Here, in a somewhat different language, is Kant's idea that critical philosophy provides the ultimate corrective to abuses of state power. Said's notion of national identity was one that disclaimed the triumph of one people over another and the insistence on homogeneity as the bottom line of a common culture. Instead, it is the recognition, enabled by critical thinkers in the humanities and social sciences especially, of its relation to other national identities, and within the nation to the multiple identities we inhabit, to the differences that bind us, to a commonality of shared differences, rather than to a genetic or historical sameness. Even more important was the lesson that, quote, human life and history are secular, that is actually constructed and reproduced by men and women. This means that there's nothing fixed about our social and political arrangements, that they are open to criticism and to change. It's precisely the specter of change, of course, that threatens the rulers of the authoritarian state. Said argued that the function of academic freedom was to protect and preserve the critical spirit, ensuring the pursuit of justice and truth wherever it might lead. Quote, Rather than viewing the search for knowledge in the academy as a search for coercion and control over others, we should regard knowledge as something for which to risk identity. And we should think of academic freedom as an invitation to give up on identity in the hope of understanding and perhaps even assuming more than one. Our model for academic freedom, Said wrote, should be the migrant or traveler, voyaging beyond familiar places, confronting the unknown. For him, academic freedom is a kind of passport for international travel, guaranteeing the right of scholars to go wherever the search for truth may lead. It was one way of addressing the tension at the heart of the mission of the modern university, that between utilitarian nationalism and non-utilitarian inquiry. Thanks. Between reason of state and reason itself. In the United States, the concept of academic freedom was formulated by a group of professors at the turn of the last century, precisely as a way of mediating that tension, of providing a rationale for an autonomous faculty, not as a peculiar elitist privilege, but as a guarantee of advancing the common good. In 1915, the newly organized American Association of University Professors, among them the American pragmatist John Dewey, articulated a vision of the university that was at once immune to powerful interests. In the United States, these were both state legislators and private benefactors, Caesar and Mammon, and that promised to serve them, however indirectly, by producing new knowledge for the common good. Their version of academic freedom rested on the notion that knowledge and power were separable. The pursuit of truth ought to have nothing to do with public conflicts of interest, even if new knowledge could weigh in on one side or another of those conflicts. The university was defined as, quote, an inviolable refuge from the tyranny of public opinion, an intellectual experiment station where new ideas may germinate and where their fruit, though distasteful to the community as a whole, may be allowed to ripen. As that last reference to distasteful reactions indicates, academic freedom was designed to protect the most critical, the most unorthodox of university faculty. A professor ought to be a contagious center of intellectual enthusiasm, wrote one university president. It's better, and this is his quote, it's better for students to think about heresies than not to think at all. Better for them to climb new trails and stumble over error than to ride forever in upholstered eaves on the overcrowded highway. Early 20th century formulations are wonderful to read. The best statement I've seen of the principle of academic freedom comes from the Regents of the University of Wisconsin in 1894. I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, and this was a plaque on the wall of the main building of the university that we read all the time. The Regents wrote this in 1894, repudiating efforts by the state legislators to fire a professor because his teaching did not conform to their economic views. This is a long quote, but worth listening to. As regents of a university with over 100 instructors, supported by nearly 2 million people who hold a vast diversity of views regarding the great questions which at present agitate the human mind, we could not for a moment think of recommending the dismissal or even the criticism of a teacher, even if some of his opinions should in some quarters be regarded as visionary. Such a course would be equivalent to saying that no professor should teach anything which is not accepted by everybody as true. That would cut our curriculum down to a very small proportion. We cannot for a moment believe that knowledge has reached its final goal, or that the present condition of society is perfect. We must therefore welcome from our teachers such discussions as shall suggest the means and prepare the way by which knowledge may be extended, present evils be removed, and others prevented. We feel that we would be unworthy of the position we hold if we did not believe in progress in all departments of knowledge. In all lines of academic investigation, it is of the utmost importance that the investigator should be absolutely free to follow the indications of truth wherever they may lead. And here comes the best line. Whatever may be the limitations which trammel inquiry elsewhere, we believe that the great State University of Wisconsin should ever encourage that continual and fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone the truth can be found. So that's the end of the quote. The autonomy of professors defended in this statement rested on the fact that the faculty was a self-regulating body, trained and credentialed according to the rules of their discipline and profession. They were, in the words of the philosopher John Dewey, an organized society of truth seekers uniquely qualified to judge one another's abilities. These organized societies were the national professional associations that trained and certified competence, a form of expertise we depend on for the advancement of knowledge in all fields. The legal scholar Robert Post put it this way: disciplines are grounded on the premise that some ideas are better than others. Disciplinary communities claim the prerogative to discriminate between competent and incompetent work. University administrators, those charged with the efficient running of the institution and its legal and financial operations, and the trustees who govern with ultimate authority, are not in a position to question the expertise of the faculty in matters of research and teaching. Instead, they share governance with the faculty, each carrying responsibility for separate activities, together ensuring the viability of the institution. The guarantee of economic freedom is at the heart of their relationship. I was reminded, as I wrote this, of an experience I had here at the CEU more than 15 years ago during the tumultuous reign of the rector, Yehuda Elkanah. At one meeting that I attended, he confronted faculty and students who were protesting the planned reform or elimination of programs in gender studies and environmental studies. There he justified his right to decide unilaterally with a phrase that was endlessly ridiculed by those who considered him something of a tyrant. A university is not a democracy, he said. In a way, of course, he was right, but not exactly. Typically, a university is not a democracy in the sense that everyone gets to vote about what is taught and how, although one of my colleagues at the Institute told me there are exceptions. In the Cambridge colleges, there is real democracy, he said, in the UK. He's an advocate, so I'm not entirely sure of what that means. But more typically, a university is a hierarchically organized cooperative society, perhaps better to say a federation, of experts with different competencies who share responsibility for its critical social mission. Trustees usually have the final say, and administrators recommend action about faculty and students to them. But a certain division of labor is also the norm. Ideally, each group respects the other's competencies in their processes of decision-making. Of course, the dangers of trustee or administrative overreach are sometimes as troubling as interference from politicians and financial patrons, but so are calls from the right, we're hearing a lot of this in the United States these days, for students' right of free speech to determine what is taught, and for what some are calling substantive neutrality or balanced interpretations in the classroom. Post's reply to this movement seems right to me, and it's a quote: disciplines do not create expert knowledge through a marketplace of ideas in which content discrimination is prohibited and all ideas are deemed equal. Although there are often conflicts within disciplines about what counts as acceptable work, critical new ideas are not always granted validity, and there have been long struggles by scholars, feminists, post-structuralists, critical race theorists, queer theorists, to achieve legitimacy for their fields of study. Still, it is academic freedom and not student free speech that informs these struggles. If academic freedom is the prerogative of a specialized group of professional intellectuals, and if the university in which they work is not technically a democracy, on what basis can the university claim its rights? Why is it that academic freedom has been the cry of university presidents and faculty facing unprecedented attacks by authoritarian politicians in Turkey, Poland, Hungary, and lately also in the United States? It may be paradoxical to argue that democracy depends on the university, even if the university itself is not a perfect democracy. But that is the case. It's the case because critical thinking, Kant's notion of reason in the face of power, or Dewey's idea that innovation depends on challenging deep-rooted prejudice, or Said's insistence that freedom cannot simply be reduced to venerating the unexamined authority of a national identity and its culture. Critical thinking is the lifeblood of democratic societies. Without it, all visions of justice and hope are lost. Critical thinking depends on informed and disciplined knowledge, on our ability to search for and to teach our students how to search for truth. That kind of teaching is not a democratic process. It cannot be one. And yet democracy depends on it. Real democracy, I should add. Illiberal democracy is an oxymoron. When the state finds itself at odds with critical thinking, we know that the search for truth has been shut down. When populist orators decry the elitism of the academic establishment, we know that knowledge production is being directed to nefarious ends. When what Said called the secular dimension of critique, its refusal of transcendent explanations for human life, whether based on history, God, or nature, when that search is replaced by invocations of essentialism, the borders of knowledge are being closed and the search for truth in whatever realm is canceled. The denial of academic freedom to its universities, of permission to pursue truth wherever it leads, signals the ultimate failure of democracy and does not bode well for the future prosperity and health of any nation. One of the ironies of the current relationship between universities and nations is that the most endangered institutions are the ones once considered the most democratic, the public universities supported by the state. Those universities which are open to students at minimal tuition costs depend on the state for financial support, but also legally the state has the ultimate authority to determine their future. Indeed, it's often in the name of protecting the public's financial interest that politicians justify their intervention in curricular and faculty domains. It is those public universities which most easily succumb to the demand that, as Said put it, intellectual discourse must worship at the altar of national identity. And so they succumb as well to the suppression of critical inquiry that is the inevitable result. The resurgence of strong nationalist tendencies is evident across the world, at least in part as a reaction to the rise of globalization and its undermining of the frontiers of national sovereignty. The reassertion of the importance of the nation is arguably the populist response to a crisis of neoliberal capitalism. This has brought with it the test of patriotism for all manner of intellectual work, a patriotism that is antithetical to free thought and the academic freedom that protects it. In the United States, we have the example of the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, warning university students that, quote, "The fight against the education establishment extends to you. The faculty, from adjunct professor to deans, try to tell you what to do, what to say, and more ominously, how to think." For DeVos, the job of educators to teach students how to think is beside the point. Her notion of freedom of thought is the expression of opinion unconstrained by the requirements of truth or rigor. The real problem for her, as for those seeking to consolidate their power at all costs, is that critique will expose the abuses that necessarily accompany authoritarian rule. In the modern period, new private universities have grown alongside public ones, often to represent special interests that weren't being served adequately in the public realm. The numbers of new private universities vary widely from country to country, as does their relationship to the state. Usually there's some kind of contractual agreement that recognizes their legitimacy as a degree-granting institution, but they tend to have greater independence than their public counterparts. In the US as elsewhere, many private universities were originally founded by religious groups, but that was not exclusively the case. And even those that were originally religious have become increasingly secular, as is the case with the American universities in Cairo and Beirut, or even with Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. Some private universities were established to provide a more elite environment for students of the upper classes, or for those with financial means but who were ineligible for admission to public schools. Although private universities typically require state certification, they are less susceptible to direct intervention than are state-supported institutions whose financial interests give the state greater power to intervene. That's why the private institutions have been able to preserve something of the critical spirit in the face of an all-out assault on higher education by those seeking to consolidate nationalist identities and to eliminate not just opposition, but also the kind of thinking that would call rulers to account for the violations of principle and justice they undertake. Of course, private universities are subject to pressures from donors and politicians. They are not immune from attempts to rein in critique and to control what is studied. Nor are they free of the neoliberal processes that are everywhere undermining the substance and ethos of a classic university education. But still, they occupy a privileged place in the realm of academe, and that privilege has made them, in our time, the custodians of academic freedom in the sense I've been talking about it, as the protection of the search for truth wherever it leads, of the spirit of critical inquiry that at its best refuses repression and compromise. If in the United States, the University of Wisconsin is no longer a place that allows for that continual and fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone truth can be found, private institutions remain in a better position to protect that legacy. It's on their campuses that it's still possible to teach freely and to resist interference. The call for academic freedom resonates with the values and principles to which they at least nominally aspire. I think that's the case for the Central European University here in Hungary. As one of several private institutions of higher education in the nation, it has long been able to stand apart from the currents and patterns of successive political regimes. It has also long been a training ground for the leadership of movements for social justice, the rule of law, and the creation of open societies in the region. On the one hand, one might ask how a small graduate institution could pose a serious threat to a government with vast military and police resources at its disposal. On the other hand, the fact of the attack signals the danger that the quest for truth by critical thinkers is seen to pose to authoritarian rule. The frightening aspect of this is that power is on the side of the state. Indeed, the resolution of the crisis might well come from a negotiation between two supposedly sovereign entities, the state of New York and the nation of Hungary. But there's also a hopeful side to the story. It suggests that despite the lamentations of scholars about the end of the university as we knew it, about what Bill Reddings called the university in ruins, and Chris Newfield deems the unmaking of the university, there's something that persists against great odds. The process of erosion of the academy has been gradual and thankfully incomplete, allowing the legacy of Kant and Humboldt to survive, even as its homogenizing cultural function has disappeared. There are pockets of resistance on campuses which honor the principles and practices of truth-seeking. We can see this in the calls for academic freedom that echo across the globe, in the thousands of protesters who filled the streets of Budapest, and who also continue to speak out in Russia, Turkey, Poland, and the United States. We can see it in the international outcry against intellectual repression that refuses to accept defeat. And perhaps ironically, we can see it too in the determination of authoritarian rulers to banish critical thought and the institutions that foster it. Their determination is a measure of the aspirational power of the idea of academic freedom, but it's only aspirational. To get rulers to value and respect it requires a political struggle, the dimensions of which are extremely large. What is the nature of that political struggle? Does it undermine the pluralism and diversity of views that are the proud values of the search for truth and the production of knowledge? I don't think so. The protection of critical thinking has always involved a confrontation with power. By its very nature, it is political. But the political struggle I'm referring to is not partisan or ideological. Rather, it commits us to the continued practice of critical thinking. The principle that guides us, that articulates the meaning of our struggle, is academic freedom. Critical thinking, in this definition of it, is both the cause and effect of academic freedom. I leave you then with something of a circular argument. We need academic freedom to protect the necessarily nonpartisan, but nonetheless political work of critical thinking, even as we must engage in that political intellectual work to bring academic freedom to life. But the politics of the moment requires more than critical thinking. It requires rallying support for the only guarantee we have that democracy can be saved or restored. I hope this conference will give us the means to begin to think and act on that requirement, to recognize the importance to say nothing of the pleasure of our intellectual work, and to find the practical political means to continue to do it. It's the challenge we urgently face, and one we have no choice but to meet. Thank you.
When you plan a conference, you have hopes that it'll get off to a good start. Judging from the smiles on faces in front of me, it's pretty clear we got off to one hell of a start. Because Joan Scott is a great scholar, and it had a historical spine to it, which gave us a sense of rootedness in time. The battles, the challenges we face are rooted in a history we have to understand. And I do want to thank Joan for this wonderful introduction. This is a session in which the crowd is part of the action, and I hope that anybody who would like to ask a question could now do so, for we have about 15 minutes until we have a break for coffee. A question, for those who don't know it, this is not a lot of people know this, it's a short interrogative statement followed by a question mark. It's a very particular kind of linguistic utterance, marked and noted for its brevity. So, and everybody gets one per customer. So I hope somebody will start us off with a question. We have microphones. There's a question in the second row here.
Thank you. My question is about freedom to start new disciplines. I understand freedom to pursue your inquiry within a discipline that is established, but I guess it's a very different freedom to start up a new field or to start up a new field of inquiry that might become a department. So how does that feature in the freedoms of academic?
Well, you're asking the right person, because in the course of my career, trained as a historian, I in fact have been very much involved in the creation of women and gender studies programs. And I briefly have a short sentence here. I've written at much greater length about it, about the tension that exists always within the older disciplines when one wants to create a new field. I think it's a tension that is unresolvable, and that academic freedom actually protects in some ways. It doesn't mean that people don't get punished for trying to violate the rules of the orthodoxy. But it is there, and we have examples of it in the formation of these new fields and disciplines. It does manage to emerge in the course of the history of new disciplinary formations. I think that's the only way to describe it. It also means that, and some of us who did this with the early women's studies, it means that you have to demonstrate a certain kind of intellectual rigor. You have to demonstrate, even though many of us are accused of being crazy political feminists. Lawrence Stone once called a book he reviewed in women's history uterine history. But even that being the case, that you run into opposition, there is a way using the standards of rigor, of disciplinary or productions of knowledge, that in fact these new disciplines have emerged and these new fields have managed to establish themselves.
Let's, I see a question there, and then I'm going to go over here. By the way, can we be heard at the back? I want to be sure we're okay. Great, great. And I particularly welcome questions from students, so get one ready. Right here.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. It seems that when we define academic freedom, we have a political bias that leads us to define it as autonomy from the state. But sociology, among other disciplines, shows us that academics define freedom as freedom from the state, but also from the market. And I was wondering if you had thoughts about either this bias or about the relationship between freedom from the state and freedom from the market in the context of rising authoritarianisms today, and how maybe they might comfort each other and mutually reinforce each other.
Well, in some ways, you answer your own question, I think. I have that quote from Yoshi in which he says, it's Mammon and Caesar that are the two forces that are being confronted. And in fact, many of the early fights around academic freedom in the United States in the early 20th century had everything to do with economic interests, with people who supported the gold standard against those who didn't, with people who supported the nationalization of railroads with those who didn't. I mean, they were all, and it was interestingly for us who now think of, some of us at least, who think of economists as rooted in particular ideological positions, it was the economists who were the radicals in the early 20th century in the United States, and who were the ones being fired like mad from the universities in which they taught. So I definitely think the question of economic interests, how they're understood, the importance, and I think I mentioned this in passing as well, at some universities of contracts now being made with private industry to direct research, control its outcome. Universities stand to profit because they can share in the patents, and researchers are put under enormous pressure to produce the results that, for example, the drug companies are looking to produce. So yes, I mean, I think that the question of economic interests is one that needs to be thought of as well. How exactly to connect it to authoritarian regimes is something I'm less certain about, partly because I just don't know enough, I think, about. I asked a friend last night what the economic situation in Hungary is, and I just don't know enough about that to sort of do the analysis that I think you're asking for.
Question in the front row, and then a question.
Michael, I do have a question which meets the criteria that you outlined, but I will take the freedom to reflect a little bit on the answer, because that is kind of institutional reflection, not necessarily a theoretical one. You both asked the question, are universities democracies or democratic institutions? And you both answered in a way they are, but with a lot of tensions and complications. And my question is CEU a democratic university? Was it when Yehuda Elkana was a rector? I think
he didn't think so.
My answer would be yes, it was democratic even then, because when he came as a rector, there was no Department of Gender Studies, no PhD program in gender studies, so he decided to dismantle the then existing program in gender and culture and create a PhD and a Department of Gender Studies. But he didn't have the right to decide on this, and the rector doesn't have the right to create new units or new programs until today. We are a democratic institution. This is not a prerogative of the board, it's the prerogative of the faculty senate. So he brought the proposal to the Senate, prepared by the group of the faculty, and that was one of the most traumatic experiences I had at this university. The Senate rejected with a large majority the proposal to create a PhD program in gender studies at CEU, which would have been the first in the region. And then, Yehuda asked me, prepare an argument. I don't know what you do, just find an argument, don't modify the proposal, but prepare an argument for the Senate to approve it. So I spent 3 weeks discussing with people who knew about gender studies, and the Senate eventually approved it. So it was the situation was solved in a democratic way in the end. I think CEU remains fundamentally democratic, but with all the tensions that you so eloquently described for other cases as well.
Question here. Is there a question up there in the gallery somewhere?
There's one there. Okay. Let's go right there, and then we've got time for a...
Thanks. We've heard throughout this lecture references to nations, to the value of universities, to nation states, etc. Turn it on its head. What value do nations have to universities? More broadly, universities existed way before the advent of the modern nation state. The modern nation state has arguably been responsible for delivering catastrophe and genocide on levels far in excess of what we've seen in recent centuries. Now, how important, how critical, in every sense, is the university as a refutation to the idea and principle of the nation as a sole embodiment of value, when universities have been historically the custodians of knowledge and of knowledge shared across communities, shared across cultures, shared across civilizations, basically custodians of the entire intellectual legacy of mankind. Therefore, isn't this dimension of their identity absolutely critical to their value and absolutely critical to what they should be bringing to the table as a challenge to the nation state per se, and to all the authoritarian interests stacked up behind it?
There you go.
Well, in principle, yes. Yes, they should, or yes, what you described is accurate. But in fact, the history is, at least since the 18th century, of the relationship that I was trying to describe between the nation state and the university. Nation states create universities in the interest of producing some kind of common cultural heritage. They succeed. Universities are indebted, in a sense, to the state for that reason. But I found Said's analysis of the corruption of the university's mission, even the university's mission to serve the nation state, a really important one. I was thinking that was my phone, but so I think in principle what you're saying is true. That is, we could idealize the vision of the university as the repository of the knowledge of all humankind, as the search for truth, unfettered by any obligation. But the fact is that this relationship was created in the 19th century and has defined the nature of the relationships ever since, and it's the one we're living with now. And I think thinking of it in terms of the tension between the importance of critique and critical knowledge for the health of the nation state is a way of rephrasing what you're suggesting, but locating it in its historical context.
We've got time for one more question from the front from Jonathan Cole, who's a trustee of this university, a distinguished former provost of Columbia University, and will be the moderator of the panel on...
I'll be briefer than that. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Joan, again, typically for a lucid and wonderful talk. When people talk about academic freedom, they very often leave out what I think is a second component to it, which is free inquiry and the attacks on free inquiry by the state, or efforts of the state to suppress free inquiry, whether it be on global climate change or whatever it might be. What are your observations about that, both from historical and contemporary examples?
The historical examples are the American ones that I know, which is that free inquiry is what's at stake in the attempts to shut down dissident voices of one kind or another. That's the origin of that University of Wisconsin quote. And that certainly, with my hat of the American Association of University Professors, the AAPP, Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure, those are the kinds of cases we see all the time. Free inquiry, challenge, not only by the state, but by donors, by political groups, and moving to the present. We're in a nightmare situation of free inquiry, even of a kind of non-threatening kind, but that looks to be critical of some political position being not only challenged by donors who threaten to withdraw their money, but lately by attacks on social media, on these people who have supposedly violated some political rule or another. So the number of death threats, there was a thing that I read this morning actually online about, which was it, I think Trinity University has closed down its campus because of death threats to a professor who said something on social media that was taken to be critical of the president. So I think we're in a situation now in which, because social media exists to quickly transmit and misrepresent many of these cases, the situation becomes a situation of danger to public order, not just to free inquiry. And the danger to public order then gives the reason to close down the institution or to remove the professor from campus because his or her presence is a threat to the security and the order of the university. So I think we're in a moment where, aggravated by in the United States at least, the loosening of civility around issues of political discussion and the reading of things that aren't political. There was this woman, the woman who talked about Greek statues as not having been white, is now being attacked by the alt-right in the United States as as somehow against whiteness. She never said anything like that. She just said that Greek statues used to be painted all different colors, and then at some point in the 19th century they all started painting them white. And this now, she has had to again be removed from campus in order to protect her from these ridiculous, and no matter what she does to try to insist on the complexity of her archaeological analysis or art historical analysis, she cannot silence these guys. So it's not a good time for free inquiry to take its course.
Let's, on that slightly somber note.
And I wanted to end on a high note.
Well, I think we have ended on a high note in the sense that we plunged right into the subject. We have begun an inquiry about why academic freedom is not an established consensual value. It's a battleground. That seems to be an extremely important thing. We've situated the history of the modern university thanks to your scholarship and wisdom. We've got off to a wonderful start. We are now going to have, and we have to have group discipline here. Whenever coffee is presented to a university audience, discipline breaks down totally. But the discipline we need is you've got to take a 15-minute break, not a 30-minute break, not a 20-minute, but a 15-minute break. Coffee is wonderful, but what we're going to do afterwards is more important, because what we're going to do afterwards is an extremely important part of today's event, which is academic freedom in Hungary. We have a very distinguished gathering of our Hungarian colleagues and friends, presided over by one of our trustees, Khan, who himself is a great academic figure in Hungary. I'd like you to take 15 minutes and come back while we reset for the first panel discussion. And again, let us thank Joan Scott.
I'll